Well, good morning, everybody. We're continuing in our survey, our study of Jacob at this point. Being that we started out of sequence with our normal quarterly rotations, I know I'm going to run out of the Jacob story before we get through the summer. So I don't know if we'll go into Joseph at that point or just what. But we've still got a few lessons left to talk about this interesting character, this guy named Jacob. Any of you, I don't want to put anybody on the spot by asking that. Let me rephrase this. Some people carry rabbit's foot, or I guess you'd say rabbit's feet. No, but you only carry one, so it would be a rabbit foot. or a four-leaf clover, or different things like that. But let's just suppose if you were carrying a rabbit's foot and something good happened to you, would you attribute what happened to that rabbit's foot? Or let's suppose, what, Mike? I'm on. Yeah. Or let's suppose that you happen to eat pizza one Sunday, and the Cowboys actually happened to win that week. Would you then eat pizza every week before the Cowboy game? Would it be because of the Cowboys or the pizza? My sons, both of them have superstitions like that. Josh is a big Nebraska Cornhuskers fan. And about an hour before the game starts, he'll put on his Cornhusker garb, and he has this little doll he puts up by the TV that's, what do they call him? Anyone know what they call the mascot for the Cornhuskers? I can't remember his name. But anyway, they go through these things. Now, I don't think Josh, well, I know he doesn't actually believe that's going to help the Huskers win. But what if someone that's on the opposing team is also eating pizza thinking it's going to help their team win? Man, you really get into a situation there, though, don't you? But even in our day, it's real easy to get caught up in these superstitions. And subconsciously, maybe even thinking those superstitions actually have something to do with the outcome of an event. But I would suggest to you that's a very dangerous place to be in as followers of Jesus. And this is a lesson that Jacob's going to have to learn. It may not appear to you by the time we get to the end of the lesson today that it is a lesson God is teaching him. But next week you'll see that. So there was this young man who was appointed to be president of a bank, and he was overwhelmed by these new responsibilities that were his. And so he sought the advice of his predecessor. He said, "Sir, what has been the secret of your success?" And the predecessor said, "Well, the secret, young man, is two words: right decisions." Well, that didn't really help him a whole lot. So the young man asked, "Well, how do you make right decisions?" The man said, "One word: experience." He said, "Well, how do you get experience?" The man said, "Two words: wrong decisions." And this is somewhat the road that Jacob finds himself on. Because there was a time in his life when he thought that success would come to him through voodoo economics. That he would eventually come to realize, though, that success comes to him because God had made promises to him that he was going to take care of him and bless him. And God's promises are so sure that even when we're bumbling around and getting in the way sometimes, God is still going to be faithful to his promises. So we're starting in chapter 30 today. If you want to open your Bibles to follow along, we're in Genesis chapter 30, verse 25. Now, if you were here last week, we worked through verse 24. And the whole first 24 verses of chapter 30 is about Jacob's children being born. At least 11 boys and one girl that we have mentioned at this point. Maybe more than that, but these are the ones we have named for us in that chapter. And verse 24 ended by telling us that Rachel finally was able to bear a child, Joseph. Okay? So this is where we're picking up right now. After Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me on my way so I can go back to my own homeland. Give me my wives and children for whom I've served you, and I'll be on my way. You know how much work I've done for you." And so 14 years Jacob has worked. Basically, he's earned 2 wives in that 14 years. But other than his 2 wives and his 12 children, at least, at this point, what else does he have? He doesn't have anything. And he's beginning to think about his future and the future of his family. His obligation to Laban is now fulfilled, and he wants to go home. He wants to go back to the land of Canaan. And so he goes to Laban, and he makes this request, "Send me on my way." Which makes me wonder, why didn't he just leave? Why does he go to Laban for permission? Well, there's several possibilities that are put forward. I don't know that any of them are it, but let me share you at least 3 possibilities. First of all, maybe he's asking for a portion of the inheritance. That's not real likely, but it's possible that's what he's implying. Second, maybe he's recognizing Laban's authority as his father-in-law. You know, in the East, particularly back in these times, it was a very patriarchal system, and you really respected the oldest male of the family. And so maybe that's it. In northeastern Iraq, a few years ago, there was an archaeological dig of an ancient city by the name of Nuzi. And they found these stone tablets. Now, these are from ancient times. And these tablets contain legal documents that provide us with some information about the culture and the lifestyle of the people of that time. Well, one of these tablets tells about, I'm not going to say it was a law, but it was a proper cultural way of doing things, that the son-in-law was pretty much under obligation to take care of the father-in-law in his old age. But this was particularly true if the father-in-law had no sons. What we're going to find out, though, Laban has sons. But it could be that Jacob is still working kind of under that premise, and he wants to be relieved of that responsibility. The third possibility is that the law of Moses, which isn't going to be written for another 500 years, but perhaps there was something in practice already that the law of Moses mentions in Exodus chapter 21 and verse 4. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. So it's possible that Jacob is thinking, I could leave, but if I do, I'm going to have to leave my wives and kids here. And maybe he's wanting permission to circumvent that. Again, we don't know for sure. Maybe it's one of those 3 things. But verse 27 says, "But Laban said to him, if I have found favor in your eyes, please stay. I've learned by divination that the Lord," and notice this is the Old Testament way of saying what? Yahweh, the name for God. "I've learned by divination that Yahweh has blessed me because of you. he added, "Name your wages, and I will pay them." It appears to me that Laban's kind of scrambling here. He hadn't really expected this to happen. And he knew that Jacob was the reason for his success. No doubt about it. And so obviously he doesn't want to see Jacob go. And so he basically ignores Jacob's request, and he makes a counteroffer instead. And he even admits to Jacob that he has resorted to divination. Okay? I want you to notice, though, that nothing in what Laban says is going to make any reference to his daughters or his grandkids. I think all he's interested in is the bottom line. Now, in all likelihood, Laban was a polytheist. Again, this is in the area of present-day Iran, Iraq, up in that area. And there was an ancient religion known as Zoroastrianism that was very caught up in divination and things like that. We know that when Abraham left his family, which Laban is a part of those relatives, right? When he left Haran, they were polytheists. And so it's very likely that Laban still is. And so he's resorted to divination. But it's interesting that he gives credit to what he finds out to Yahweh. But Laban, being the shyster that he is, maybe just throwing that in because he knows that might make Jacob more favorable to what he's offering. The fact is, Laban has prospered a lot in Jacob's time with him. Laban has been the beneficiary of God's blessing on Jacob. So, as he had said to Jacob 14 years before, Laban says, "Name your wages." Jacob asked for Rachel 14 years earlier, and what happened? He got Rachel, but he got Leah too. And so it's kind of that fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And Jacob isn't going to fall for that kind of trick again. It seems he's already prepared a plan. And we see that in verse 29. Jacob said to him, "You know how I've worked for you and how your livestock has fared under my care. The little you had before I came has increased greatly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I have been. But now, when may I do something for my own household?" "What shall I give you?" he asked. "Don't give me anything," Jacob replied, which Laban probably nearly fell over in excitement about that. Jacob knew how to talk to this deceiver, because Jacob was a pretty good one himself, right? And so he reminds Laban in verse 30 that Laban had a pretty small operation when Jacob arrived. Pretty small operation. But since that time, he says, the flocks have increased greatly. Now, this is an interesting Hebrew word. It's the meaning of it is to break forth. It's the idea of imagine a dam, and you're getting flood waters, and it's putting a lot of pressure on that dam, and finally the dam is breached. And when it does, what happens? I mean, the water just bursts forth, right? And that's the idea kind of behind this Hebrew word is, man, when Jacob comes along Laban's flocks, it's a flood. And Laban doesn't want to lose the source of his success. He knows where his success is coming from. And Jacob acknowledges that, but he wants to know, what can I do to provide for me and my children? So Laban appears to be willing to enter into a new contract. Jacob makes his proposal. But if you'll do this one thing for me, I'll go on tending your flocks and watching over them. Let me go through all your flocks today and remove from them every speckled or spotted sheep, every dark-colored lamb, and every spotted or speckled goat. They will be my wages. And my honesty will testify for me in the future whenever you check on the wages you've paid me. Any goat in my possession that is not speckled or spotted, or any lamb that is not dark-colored, will be considered stolen. Agreed, said Laban. Let it be as you have said. Jacob doesn't want a salary. He says, all I want is a profit-sharing situation. Let me have just a percentage of the profits. And he proposes to go through Laban's flock and remove all of the dark-colored lambs or any goats that are speckled or spotted, and that's it. Now, in the Middle East, most sheep are white. Well, I guess they are for the most part here too, aren't they? And goats were usually solid color, mostly black. And occasionally, though, this recessive gene would show up, giving an odd color or a marking to them. Now, being that it's a recessive gene means it doesn't happen very often, right? It's fairly rare. And so Jacob is proposing, let me just take this rare occurrence, let me take the rejects of your flock. That's all I'm asking for. And so I'll go through your flock, and I'll remove any sheep that isn't white, and I'll remove any goat that's striped or speckled in some way. And being that we're both deceitful people, that way if I ever have a sheep that's white or a goat that's black, you know that I've stolen from you. Sounds like a pretty good deal, doesn't it? And Laban can't believe his ears. He never dreamed that he would get such a sweet deal. The rejects of his flock is all Jacob's asking for, which were very few. And so for practically nothing, Laban's getting the assurance that Jacob's going to continue to take care of his flocks for years to come. It's an offer Laban can't refuse. But as sweet as this deal already is, Laban, this deceiver, which is often the case with people like this, good isn't good enough. And so he's already got this plan in motion of how he can cheat his son-in-law out of even the little that he's asking for. He's going to make sure that Jacob gets off to a slow start, which will assure what? That Jacob's with him even longer. Okay? So here's what Laban does. That same day, he removed all the male goats that were streaked or spotted, and all the speckled or spotted female goats, all that had white on them, and all the dark-colored lambs, and he placed them in the care of his sons. Then he put a 3-day journey between himself and Jacob, while Jacob continued to tend the rest of Laban's flocks. So what's Laban doing here? You start with nothing. The only way you're ever going to build a flock is starting today. If this recessive gene shows up, then you can have something. But you're not getting anything from the get-go. But Jacob's even more shrewd. He didn't make this deal because he's a pushover. He had a few tricks up his sleeve as well. Unfortunately, his tricks depended upon superstition. And all of them have the same goal, which is for him to become rich at Laban's expense. Laban wants to become rich at Jacob's expense. Jacob wants to become rich at Laban's expense. Good family dynamics going on here. But do you notice anything that's missing in our story? Like God? Proverbs 3 and verse 5 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He'll make your paths straight." But that's not what Jacob's doing. This patriarch that has had these great promises given to him. You know, our own understanding only leads us to do things that seem to be right, but oftentimes end up with heartache and hardship and pain, right? So verse 37 says, Jacob, however, took fresh cut branches from poplar, almond, and plane trees, and made white stripes on them by peeling the bark and exposing the white inner wood of the branches. Then he placed the peeled branches in all the watering troughs so that they would be directly in front of the flocks when they came to drink. When the flocks were in heat and came to drink, they mated in front of the branches, and they bore young that were streaked or speckled or spotted. Jacob set apart the young of the flock for themselves, but made the rest face the streaked and dark-colored animals that belonged to Laban. Thus he made separate flocks for himself and did not put them with Laban's animals. Whenever the strong females were in heat, Jacob would place the branches in the troughs in front of the animals so that they would mate near the branches, but if the animals were weak, he would not place them there. So the weak animals went to Laban and the strong ones to Jacob. Ron, is this the way that you would suggest to people to breed a flock? It's one way. I mean, this is hocus pocus. Jacob takes these branches and he peels them and puts stripes on them and things of that nature. Now understand though, back in nearly 2000 BC, they had no understanding of genetics. They went off the superstitions. And the common belief apparently in that day was that what a mother sees when she is being bred is what that baby's going to end up looking like. So if a mother sees something striped or something spotted, that baby's going to be striped or spotted. It's a good thing paisley wasn't in fashion back then, right? But Jacob also practices the ancient equivalent of selective breeding, doesn't he? Who's he making sure is bred? Who's he giving special attention to in this breeding? The strongest. I mean, this is selective breeding that Jacob's getting involved in here. He made sure they were placed among these superstitious tree limbs, and his plan appears to work, doesn't it? Laban gets the weaker offspring. Jacob gets the stronger ones. But is it due to Jacob's superstition? Not bottom line. And if some of you have read ahead, you already know this. It's not until the next chapter, but God is going to make it clear to Jacob why this plan worked. It's because in spite of Jacob's superstition, God's fulfilling His promise to him. Okay? I don't think it has any more to do with the way these animals breeded than if you eat pizza on Cowboy Day. And what we see is Jacob trusting in a deception again, instead of trusting in a God who has already promised him that he's going to provide for him. God's going to make that very clear, as I said, in chapter 31. So verse 43 says, "In this way the man grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys." Which is a way of letting us know just how wealthy Jacob is becoming. This is the way wealth was measured in those days. The size of the flocks, the numbers of servants. And so he's making enough money, or making enough bartering power, that he's able to get female and male slaves. He's camels, donkeys. Camels were the Cadillac of that day. They were rare and they were expensive. But he's amassing this fortune, you might say. Notice what it says, "in this way." At least that's what it says in the NIV. And I don't really like the liberty they've taken here, because the Hebrew just says "and." Can you see why I don't really like the liberty taken by saying "in that way"? To me, it suggests that Jacob has actually come to this place through this superstitious practice. But all the original Hebrew says is, "and the man grew exceedingly prosperous." Okay? He gets rich because God is being faithful to his promise. All this other stuff was just a bunch of wasted energy and unnecessary work. Now, don't get me wrong, if you're into ranching or whatever, I don't think selective breeding means you're going to get, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Jacob's putting his trust in some of this superstitious stuff. He probably didn't even know what selective breeding was. Well, but maybe they may have had some idea at that time, I don't know. But he trusted in a scheme rather than trusting in God. Now, I don't believe that God rewards laziness. So I'm not saying in this that Jacob should have just sat back and done nothing. But I do want to remind us of this. James chapter 1 and verse 17 says, "Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights." Do you believe that? I mean, do you acknowledge that in your own life? Every good thing we have comes from God. Our every success, our every blessing comes from God. And not only that, God delights in giving his children good things. And this is a lesson that Jacob is still in the process of learning. God loved Jacob. God was determined to bless Jacob. And anything Jacob had or anything we have is a blessing that comes from the Father. And so there were two Kentucky horse breeders who had developed a strong rivalry. And one spring, they both entered a horse in a local race. One of the horse breeders, thinking it might give him an advantage, decided to hire a professional jockey to ride his horse. Well, the horses were neck to neck when they got to the home stretch, way distancing the rest of the field. It was down to these two horses, when suddenly both of them stumbled and fell, throwing both of the riders out of the saddle. But the professional jockey quickly got up and jumped back on and won the race. And so he's returning to the stables where he found the man who had hired him, and he was fuming. And the jockey said, "What's the matter? I just won the race." To which the man said, "Yeah, you won the race all right, but you crossed the finish line on the wrong horse." This is what Jacob was doing. Jacob appears to have succeeded here, but he's riding the wrong horse. Do we ever do that? We get on the wrong horse oftentimes. Maybe we get on the wrong horse of self-achievement. You do know that our own effort cannot remove one sin from our lives. You do realize that, right? I mean, Paul put it so beautifully in Ephesians chapter 2 when he said, it's by grace you've been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it's the gift of God, not of works, so that no one can boast. And sometimes our own self-effort we think might make us more holy or more righteous. So Paul beautifully reminds us in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 3, are you so foolish? After beginning by means of the Spirit, are you now trying to finish by means of the flesh? And Jesus himself said, John 15 and verse 5, apart from me, you can do a little bit. No, you can do nothing, is what Jesus said. Apart from me, you can do nothing. And we need to learn to live daily dependent upon Him. Otherwise, we're going to just be expending energy and frustrating and wasted efforts. Well, I'm going to be finishing a little bit early. I'm very open to if anyone has anything they'd like to add to our story. And maybe this will be a seed for you to think about. But since Jacob is forever the schemer, I mean, he was named properly, right? And since he was forever the schemer, God must be blessing Jacob despite his flawed character. Do you agree? He's blessing him despite his flawed character and not because of his character. Why do you think that is? Yeah, he does. That's right. That's right. And God's going to get his plans done, one way or another. Okay, good. Why else do you think that he uses a flawed person like Jacob for his purposes? An example? Okay. What other choices did he have? That's right. I mean, we really need to, even though we might not be a person of deception like Jacob, we need to all realize that we're flawed instruments that this is what he's got. And that really ought to be an encouragement to us, shouldn't it? I mean, every person he chose to be a part of this special covenant, all the patriarchs. I mean, we hold up Abraham as, outside of Jesus, perhaps the greatest man of faith in the Bible. Man, Abraham had some issues. Isaac had some issues. Jacob has some issues. God chose flawed people to work through and to fulfill his purposes. And what hope does that then offer us? Yes, exactly. Don't miss that in these stories. It ought to give us hope. And so I used to sit back and kind of point, why did they do this? Why did they do that? They did those kinds of things because they're like me. We're flawed people, saved by the grace of God. And when we let his Spirit work in us, though, God can still make some pretty incredible, beautiful things happen, can't he? So, I'm done. Yeah. We don't know. I can't remember. I don't think it tells us later on. I could be wrong. But I'm not sure we ever know that, KC. It had to be a pretty extended period of time for him to build wealth out of nothing, right? I would think even if God's speeding up the timetable, it's still going to take a while for that recessive gene to repeat itself enough to where he's built up. Of course, God can make the recessive gene be the more dominant one for a while, but it's still going to take a while to build a flock. Mm-hmm. That was while he was with Laban, during that 14 years. Yeah. Yeah. Laban had a pretty small operation when Jacob comes along, and now Laban apparently is very wealthy. Well, because of God, ultimately, as we're going to see next week. Right. That's right. That's right. But I don't think we have any idea of the time frame. Denver, I'll come right back to you. Okay. See, I couldn't remember if there was some. Yeah, so I guess another 6 years perhaps. Yeah. 6 years is a pretty quick amount of time to turn something like this around. Yeah, and I'm glad you noticed that. Okay, I'll come back to you, Mike. Oh, okay, yeah, that's what I was telling you. I couldn't remember I've read ahead, but I just couldn't remember if there was something that we could, that would tell us. Mm-hmm. Okay. Right. Yeah. But I think for him to build a flock like this that quickly, we got to attribute it to God. You know, God has stepped in and pulled this thing off. Yeah. In fact, that's the reason Laban had been blessed, is because God was with Jacob. Good comments. At this point, I imagine it does. I don't know if y'all could hear, but she said, doesn't that kind of confirm to Jacob at least that his deception is really working? And at this point it does. That's why in chapter 31, God is going to tell him very directly, this is because of what I have done. Yeah, good point. Mm-hmm. 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 He has a way of doing that, doesn't he? And sometimes it's not too pleasant. Yeah. All right. Pray with me, would you? Father, again, we are grateful for these old stories that are so filled with just observations about us as humans and about you being a faithful God that continue to bless us today. And so I'm praying we won't miss that today. As we get caught up in the stories themselves, let us always remember that this is really your story. These are just people who you happen to be working through and alongside of. And I pray that we can see that more even in our own lives, that this is our story too. And we're grateful for this opportunity to gather here and to worship today. And we would just really have blown the whole thing if we don't come today, Father.